Welcome to REM Reward, the podcast that explores the secrets of sleep and psychology. I'm your host, Ryan, and in each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of sleep and other topics such as mental well-being and personal growth. If you want to unlock your full potential and receive the rewards that come with understanding the power of sleep, you're in the right place. To discover more tips and insights on improving your sleep and overall well-being, visit our website and explore our other episodes at remreward.org. Today we're joined with Drew Ackerman, the creator and host of Sleep With Me, a podcast that has transformed bedtime routines for listeners everywhere. Sleep With Me emerged from Drew's own battle with insomnia, blending storytelling with humor to provide a unique way to unwind and fall asleep. Drawing on his childhood as the oldest of six, a diverse job history, and a love for late-night comedy, Drew has crafted a podcast that has been featured in the New York Times, The New Yorker, and more. We're excited to dive into how Drew turned his personal struggles into a comforting escape for so many. Okay, so can you just share how your own experiences with insomnia played a role in the development of your podcast, Sleep With Me?
Yeah, so my dog, as soon as we started recording, my dog's got
No
she's
worries.
moving around. Um, so my experience with insomnia started when I was a kid in before like in elementary school. I had difficulties learning and it caused me a lot of stress where I would be thinking
Mm.
about it at night and worrying about going to school and getting in trouble. And I just spend the whole night thinking oh, well, how can I do better at school? Or, oh, what are the teachers going to be upset about? Or whatever it was. And it was really painful. And everybody else in my family didn't have a problem sleeping. So when I would tell them about it, they'd kind of be like, oh, yeah, why don't you not think about school? Or why don't you think about something nice? Or why
Right.
don't you try something like that? And I would try that. I'd be like, I'm trying to fall asleep. It's not like I don't want to fall asleep. And so it was really isolating in a sense, even though I had a room, I shared my room with my brother. It just was like this different kind of loneliness.
Right.
And at some point, this other kid at school told me, "Oh, my older brother listens to like comedy radio, there's comedy on the radio late at night." And so I'd start listening to the radio late at night and listening to like comedians and there was like parody songs and stuff like that. And it didn't help so much help me fall asleep as like make it less painful and make it feel less lonely. And sometimes I'd fall asleep just because I was distracted from my thinking and my thoughts. And other times it just didn't feel as bad. And as I got older, I kind of remembered both the pain of not being able to sleep and that distraction that the radio shows offer me. And then once I started listening to podcasts and realized, hey, you could make a podcast about anything, I was like, oh man, like maybe I can make a podcast that's like similar to when I couldn't sleep as a kid.
Yeah, I love that. Wow, it's a really great story. And I think you probably just touched upon this, but like, can you describe the concept behind Sleep With Me and what really sets it apart from other bedtime story podcasts?
Yeah, so Sleep With Me is the idea of the show is it's geared towards adults. It's not necessarily adult in content or like
Right.
nature, but like I think that children like younger children just have a different they like a different storytelling style where
Yeah.
adults like something that's a little bit more meandering and a little bit has a narrative but it's hard to follow. So the best version or best way to explain Sleep With Me is it's almost like if you were going to call a friend and you're laying in bed and you're like, hey, could you just tell me about your day or your homework or the
Right.
trip you took with your parents? And you know, it doesn't have to be interesting, but I'm barely going to listen to you too, and I'm going to fall asleep. And they're like, "Yeah, sure, I'll tell you about these shows I just watched." And they're like, "Yeah, well, first I press play. Well, oh wait, let me back up. Like then first I had to find I couldn't find a link to you know it's
Right.
so,
Yeah.
so it's like to take your mind off of stuff and help you relax. Where I think a lot of other stuff, particularly when I started the show 11 years ago, the idea of bedtime stories for grown-ups wasn't necessarily a thing. Everything around bedtime was more straightforward and serious and like this is going to put you to sleep or we're going to hypnotize you
Yeah.
or and I was like, "Oh, I don't want something that direct. I want to
Right.
make something that's more indirect."
Yeah, I really like that idea. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then yeah, so also going back, it's like you've had a variety of jobs before starting Sleep with Me. I saw online it was like a fuzzy dice salesperson, a fruit fly monitor, and a jail librarian. So how do those contribute to creating the podcast? Or I guess like, can you just explain what those roles entail to you?
Yeah, so I was one of those kids and adults that couldn't quite find their way. Like I was like, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's like, oh, I love movies and I love this kind of stuff,
Right.
but I don't know. And so I took a meandering path and I would try out different jobs. I've always been a very curious person and a person that's willing to try or take risks and do something interesting. And so I ended up like doing a bunch of jobs and I never really had a real career starting out because it was like, oh, let me see what this is like. Oh, I'll be a PE teacher. Oh, I don't know if I like being I'm good at that. Let me try out like yeah, like
Right.
doing this or doing that. And each job in a sense that spirit of like curiosity and of openness and imperfection. Like that was a gift my parents gave me. It was like, hey, we want you to try and find something that works for you. Um, like, but be open-minded. I think that really informs the creation of the podcast and the content too.
Yeah, I love that. And then yeah, going to your podcast, like how do you come up with these like really unique storylines and themes for each episode?
Well, I mean, part of it is fun. It's fun to like. I've always been someone that I like playing with toys as a kid and imagining stuff as a kid, and I like reading books. I liked watching movies and TV shows and reading comics, and so like I've always had a curious imagination, and I've always had. I've been lucky that it's like I have a pretty vivid imagination,
Mhm.
and so that part's there. And so the other pieces are like always, well, I guess not always paying attention, but I guess I've learned and trained myself, especially through the podcast, to like keep an eye out to what I'm interested in. Like, oh, like what's that bird? I haven't seen that bird before. Oh, like, oh, look at all those pelicans. They're hanging out together. Oh, what then you're like, oh, I wonder what they're talking about. And then it's
Yeah,
like, oh,
yeah.
wait a second, that could be a story for Sleep with Me. Like, oh,
Yeah, love
do
that.
pelicans keep secrets? I don't know. Like, yeah, so it's like that kind of attitude. I heard it once. This isn't my quote, but someone talks about it in a sense of like you're going around the world in your regular day and you're gathering thread.
Mm.
And they said like you just keep gathering thread. You see one piece of thread there. It's like the way someone said hi to you. You see another thread there. It's like, oh, that person's dressed very vividly, and those are like later on your subconscious the kind of story comes out of those threads.
Yeah. I really like that thread analogy. Yeah. And then yeah, so how do you balance like the need to, I guess, entertain your like listeners and then but also help them fall asleep? Or is it like one comes with the other?
I guess that's a really good question, and I thought about it for a little while. I think it's like maybe two things to think about, or what I was thinking about it is like one is like a lot of the podcast is informed by when I sit down to record, I'm trying to inhabit a space that I'm talking to one person who's having trouble falling asleep and imagining them and how I would be there for them and kind of trying to put what I'm regular daytime me is worried about aside. And even the idea of making even though I always want to be perfect, or some part of me is like, this better be the best episode you ever make,
Right.
setting that aside to be like, I'm just here to tell one person a story. That's important. And I think the other thing that's important is this oh man, I guess I lost it. Like I had something else I was thinking about that. What's the question again? Let me see if I could
Yeah.
remember it.
I was going to ask like how do you balance the need to like entertain your listeners at the same time with like helping them fall asleep or does one like fall upon the other?
Oh yeah. Okay. So the other one is that is like why I love making the show. Like because it's like a puzzle
Mm.
every time I make the show, and part of it is editing. So part of it is like after I'll listen to the podcast and edit it out and then, or change something in a future episode. But it's always like, hey, what can I do? Can I follow this train of thought? And then like, oh, what if something comes up that's kind of scary? Can I navigate around it? Or like, covering something like we did shows about Game of Thrones in the past, and it's like, oh, how do you take the content that's like can be very extreme and it's
Right.
and not sleepy and change that around to make it more sleepy.
Yeah, so it's like tweaking little things. I like that a lot. Yeah. And then, so what feedback have you received from listeners about the impact of Sleep With Me on their sleep, and how's it influenced, I guess, like the podcast direction and future episodes?
It definitely it influences future episodes. Like a lot of people will tell me, hey, like stuff I didn't even realize. Like when I first started making the show, I didn't realize how many people's sleep was impacted by chronic pain. Like that's an
Really?
entire portion of sleepless people that they're not able to sleep because of their chronic pain, but it's also like, oh, there's something we share that it's like they also have all these thoughts about chronic pain. And so like the podcast can be there to distract them just like it can for somebody that's overthinking or somebody that's dealing with heartache or they're going through mourning or whatever. And
Hmm.
so it's like looking for like the things, these commonalities in the feelings, even though people are having these different experiences. That's like what I get from a lot of feedback. And then there's more specific feedback. Like early on, people be like, I would talk about snakes or spiders, and people be like, "What are you doing? Like, you can't talk about a snake, a
Yeah.
cobra on a sleep podcast." So it's a little bit of each one. But in the end, what is touching to me is that a lot of the emails I get are people just like sharing their experience, like, hey, this is what I've dealt with or what I'm dealing with, and this is how the podcast impacted me.
Mhm.
And that kind of runs counter, like these people sending me these thank you emails, like to like the idea of like that we're this world full of conflict is that there is this like subset of people out there that are full of gratitude
Yeah.
and they're struggling too, and that kind of helps inform the podcast because it's like, oh yeah, we're not. It feels like we're alone a lot of the times, or like the idea of like digital, like intimacy or however you want to put it,
Right.
like, but it's real. It's just hard to quantify or put your finger on.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah. And then yeah, so how do you like ensure the content of Sleep With Me is effective in promoting better sleep for your listeners? Are there like any specific elements you focus on?
Well, I listen to the shows a couple times before they come out, and I have like other people I work with, and we listen to the episodes.
Right.
And what I'll do is like I'll go for a walk and I'll listen to it, and if something sticks out to me, like I'll take a screenshot of that moment, and then I can go back and be like, okay, what was it at 14:21? And I'll like pay really close attention. I'll be like, oh, I was talking about I don't know, something that maybe is like people might feel is political, or maybe that's it's like related to money and finances, and that's like, okay, can we edit that out? And that was based on feedback from the past.
Hmm.
So it's kind of just again another way of paying attention and being imperfect. Like a lot of times I hear about it afterwards, or I'll be stressed out in the show. Like maybe there'll be a period where the show is like I'm talking faster because in my day-to-day life I'm really stressed. So it's
Right.
also about like adjusting and just like, hey, okay, let me take that feedback and kind of parse it. And there's sometimes there's people like with all internet stuff, their feedback is not constructive, and it's also learning to
Yeah.
navigate that stuff too, and be like,
Yeah, for sure.
okay, let's just agree to disagree.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely could be some harsh feedback out there. Yeah. And then yeah, so how have you incorporated like I don't know, have you like incorporated any specific techniques or strategies that you use in the podcast that have helped with your sleep? Like have you seen kind of like a benefit of the viewers and yourself?
Yeah, there's two things. Like right now, I'm going through a period of like terrible sleep. Like I could like some nights I get sleep, and then some nights I have trouble falling asleep, or I'm
Right.
waking up a lot. And that one now knowing, like I make the show, and like so many different people listen to the podcast, or like people like you reach out, and it's like, and I know like you get it because I can see the look on your face. It's like knowing that other people have struggled
Mhm.
with this or are struggling with it
Sure.
helps. The other specific things I've learned is like having a wind down routine works for me like a lot of the times. And I talk about that a lot on the podcast and even the structure of the show. So it's like, hey, if I want to be asleep at like 11:30, maybe at like 10:30, I've got to start, reading a book or drawing or doing something relaxing to ease into bedtime. And then the other side is when I can't sleep or I'm waking up or I wake up super early it's like having a little bit softer approach to myself instead of getting really irritated or frustrated or, oh, I can't believe this is happening to me. Like I started this during the pandemic where I called it laying. Like I'd be like, okay, it's 4:30, I'm wide awake. I'm just gonna lay here and relax.
Yeah.
And if I don't fall asleep, like I'll just lay here for another half hour and then I'll get up. But I'll just lay and chill. And so kind of having like a more fun approach
Yeah.
where, I mean, especially when you have to get up early for something specific, I'm sure you can relate. You're like, or you're anticipating something like the
Sure.
SATs or whatever. You're like, I've got to sleep. Now I'm
Yeah,
really
for
mad.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it really is just like kind of like not taking it too seriously, like just kind of like taking a little chill for it. Yeah. Um, yeah. So going along with that, I'm curious, like myself, like what was your process of turning your idea of like sleep with me into a reality? Like were there any like big challenges you faced along the way, maybe for other people who want to start like putting their ideas out in the world? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start with your ideas are important and they should be out in the world. And like but the going from that to like doing it, if like I have a very strong internal critic, and
Mhm.
so that was my biggest challenge at first. Was like I came up with the idea years before I followed through on it because it was like, oh, that's such a silly idea. That's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
like terrible. Like why would you do that? Or that would be embarrassing, or you don't know how to make a podcast, so why bother? And the idea kept coming back and back. So I think like for me now, I try to pay attention when ideas come back more than once and like, oh, am I being too critical or should I give this a try? And I have a little bit more space to be like, yeah, I'm afraid, but I'll try anyway. Because
yeah.
I've learned that it's important to try it out and see what happens. And then the show, I knew nothing, like I'd never recorded any audio. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I was just like, I got lucky and like, hey, let me try to do this for a couple years just as a hobby and put it out regularly and just see what happens. And that would be my metric for success. If I like do it for 2 years, that's going to be success. And then when I got to 2 years, it was kind of like, hey, I'll just keep making this. And I still had a full-time job and stuff, but it was like, hey, this is benefiting people and it's kind of
Yeah.
fun. Let me see what happens.
Yeah, I really like that. Like just taking that like step forward and just trying things out. Yeah, I love that. And then going with that, like, do you have any favorite moments or memorable stories you have from like creating the podcast that really stands out to you? Maybe a message you got, a memory you have about it, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, this one's kind of intense. Like my mom just passed away like
Oh,
earlier in the
sorry to hear that.
summer.
Yeah.
Thank you. But like the podcast was like something kind of when I was starting it out, I was kind of like self-conscious to even tell my parents or my
Mhm.
family. Not that they would have judged it, but it was like I had this
Different.
weird
Yeah.
sense of protection of like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm just going to do this and I don't want anybody to know about it. And my mom went into the hospital like after I'd been making the show for a few months, and she was telling me how hard it was for her to sleep. And I was like, oh, that's like, this is kind of like a
Perfect.
synchronicity. And I was like, why don't you try listening to this podcast I've been making? And ever since then, like my mom would listen to the show when she would be in the hospital or when she'd be having trouble falling asleep. And then it became like, as my mom got sick, or sicker, my dad would listen to the podcast, like because he'd be so stressed. And
Right.
so it's like, it hits a little bit different when it's your family.
Sure.
And like, but it also goes back to this thing we're talking about of like, hey, a lot of times when I'm afraid or critical of myself, I'm wrong and I'm holding back something that it could be shared with others in my family or in the world at large.
Yeah, for sure. I really love that. Like it's again, as you said, that a lot of people have sleep issues for a variety of different reasons, and no one's really alone in that aspect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So along with that, I'm almost like I think those are the final few questions I had. I was just gonna ask if there's anything else you would like our audience to know, or I guess maybe one thing you want our audience to take away from this podcast.
I think like that to give yourself a break. I think like that's the one thing I've learned is like whether it's with not being able to sleep or you're trying to launch some kind of project, you have this big idea like, oh, I want to try this, or hey, I think I want to study this, or I'd like to do this on the side. like is to like be curious about that. Like, I don't know, my first instinct is usually like fight or flight, like, oh, that's a bad idea, or oh, like that's going to be too much work, or fantasy of like, oh, that idea is going to be perfect and it's going to make everything perfect.
Sure.
But when you take the attitude of like, hell, what's this? This is interesting, like you would with a friend or a sibling or a cousin or whatever, you'd be like, oh, really? That's interesting. Like, whether it's even if you can't sleep, it's like, well, what are you thinking about? Oh, I'm kind of worried about this. Oh, okay. That like middle approach has unlocked a lot of things for me that like impacted the podcast that I used to not. When I tried to force my way through it or
Yeah.
turn away from it, it didn't work.
Yeah, I really love that message. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm sure our viewers are just as grateful as I am for you to come on and take your time to speak about your experiences. I'll make sure to link everything below that is related to you. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being curious and wanting to talk about it. It was great.
Thank you for tuning into the REM Reward podcast. Before you go, we'd appreciate your support by subscribing, liking, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for our next podcast, where we will be joined by a special guest speaker to explore even more about the fascinating world of sleep and psychology.